Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
How are you, Jordan? Everything all right? MashaAllah, just got back from work.
Alhamdulillah, yeah, it was a bit of a rush, but yeah, got here in time. Actually, I think we're on time today, so I think people are
Alhamdulillah.
impressed.
Dead on time, alhamdulillah.
Dead on time.
Setting a new trend, mashallah, I like that. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's start the stream. I mean, the first thing I actually want to open up by saying, Imran, is I don't know about you, and I don't know about you, Jordan, because we haven't sort of obviously discussed this, Jordan. You just literally, got home. But I mean, shortly before this stream, we had a message saying, "Oh, you guys perhaps shouldn't be doing the stream now. Things are very sensitive," and it sort of got me thinking, And I thought to myself, "Are we doing something wrong here?" And actually, it made me a little bit nervous for the first time coming on a stream, And I thought to myself, why am I nervous? And it just shows just how good this narrative of Muslims having to come out and condemn everything and really showing their hand, showing their cards, on the table. Otherwise, any sort of discussion like this can be misconstrued to somehow being, excusing these things or somehow quietly accepting these things, And I thought to myself, if I was a white guy, not Muslim, would I be concerned? Would I be thinking about these things? And probably not, And so actually, Jordan, what I wanted to ask you was, firstly, did that cross your mind? And secondly, obviously, you're new to Islam. You accepted Islam just a very short, a year or two ago, right? 3 years ago, I believe. Is that right? What's the exact time that you?
Yeah, 2.5 years, probably. Just
about 2.5 years ago, right? So, I mean, just out of interest, before you were Muslim, and if you were perhaps interested in doing this type of stream, would you have thought about all of these things, or have you thought about them post being Muslim, or how's it sort of changed for you? It'd be very interesting to know, because for me, I must admit, the nerves started coming in, and I thought to myself, why am I feeling this way? And it just proved to me just how good the narrative has been out there, how good this programming has been out there to convince the masses, the vast majority of people, Muslims, who clearly wouldn't accept any form of violence in this way, vigilantism, being vigilante, going out and doing something so horrible, But it just shows how good this sort of programming has been out there. So I'm just wondering, Jordan, what would you have felt like pre-Islam and sort of post-Islam?
Yeah, I think with these things, I mean, when I think back to, obviously there were various things that happened when I was non-Muslim. I don't think I really thought too much about them, but I do think they sort of played. Probably they sort of store in the back of your mind, and the media certainly has an impact. And I think people know my story. I was fairly ignorant before, and I think most people are. I don't think I wasn't necessarily out there to sort of push any kind of agenda or anything. I think you just sort of a bit ignorant to what's happening. What is a real shock post Shahada is probably all of a sudden how I'm now all of a sudden asked certain questions about, I'm having to free myself from things. And I'm all of a sudden, I'm part of a group that is, in my mind, I accepted Islam, the beauty of Islam and the things that, all of the stuff that we're going to go on to is absolutely abhorrent to Islam. So I don't, in my mind, I don't see the connection. But there's certainly, it's certainly pushed out there a connection. But yeah, I think that's really the main thing for me post Shahada is having to almost feel responsible in these times to speak up. And that's not why, I did a stream on my channel the other day. For me personally, this topic brings out many perhaps double standards from France, and perhaps it really there are certain things that can be discussed about. And I think that we start by outrightly saying, obviously, what happened was wrong, and we're going to do a stream next week on presumed guilty, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
I certainly don't feel like I have to answer that question, but I've chosen to come online and discuss the topic because I think there are many parts into it that I think are good to discuss.
One of the other things that obviously I would just want to ask you, Jordan, before Imran inshallah comes in with his pearls of wisdom, mashallah, is that pre-Islam, if you would have heard this sort of incident, perhaps being quite ignorant about Islam because you hadn't studied Islam, what would your perception of this incident have been? And post-Islam, accepting Islam, learning about Islam, experiencing Islam over the last 2.5 years, how's that view perhaps changed from how you would have reacted, let's say, back then?
Yeah, I think, look, if you don't know what the Quran says, if you don't know what the Prophet, peace be upon him, did or what it was all about, and this is all you heard, I think in the back of your mind you may actually think, well, why is all this happening? And now I would hope that, and I believe the majority of people can see right through. I think most people in this country understand what's happening in the Middle East. Most people understand, have a bit of a more nuanced approach to why things are happening, as opposed to just connecting Islam to certain things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I guess the lack of knowledge, and that's why I enjoy doing these streams. We did a few over lockdown. Is actually just, I think the best thing to do is tell people what Islam actually is all about. And that's the best way, I would say, of differentiating, things from abhorrent things that do happen. Yeah.
And I think, the interesting thing for me, of course, is that if Islam truly had been a religion that was barbaric, as the cliche or the stereotype for many of these media outlets and haters are, why would it be the fastest growing religion in Europe? And in America, you don't obviously look like a person who loves violence and loves oppression, and that's why you've chosen Islam. Often people spend, on average, I think it's 7 years studying comparative religion, and surprisingly, they convert to a religion or revert to a religion that preaches hatred and intolerance. And I think for a lot of people, if they were just to really just think about that one sort of piece of evidence, there's the old saying, in England, we say the proof in the pudding is in the eating, and once you've experienced Islam truly for what it is, and you studied Islam, the fact that you would accept it, I think, really does go against a lot of the stereotypes that people sort of attribute to Islam and to Muslims. And surprisingly, I mean, the case is that 72% of the converts are women.
Yeah. Well, Abbas, if I can mention one before I forget it, is that I remember having a conversation with Hamza, because when I, before my Shahada, you hear about grooming gangs, terrorism, you hear about these things. Yeah. And I remember having a conversation thinking, hang on a minute, everything I've researched, I'm much less likely to be a groomer now. I'm much less likely to do anything that you see in the media on what I've learned from Islam, and that's where I think for a revert it's very confusing sometimes when you then see a narrative being pushed about the religion you've embraced. So
Imran, what's your view on this then? Apparently, we Muslims are somehow complicit. We're all sort of wanting these type of things to happen, and Islam somehow sanctions these things, according to people like Macron and some of the French ministers that have come out and said some atrocious things, like one of the things that was said was that the enemies of the Republic cannot expect a minute respite, and this was said by the Interior Minister in France. And it's this type of language, I think, that one would not necessarily go against this type of rhetoric if it was truly just going to affect or be concentrated on the perpetrators of these type of things. But it just seems like a net's being cast out, and that net sort of is for like almost everyone. If you're called Abdul or Abbas or Imran, you're in this net as well, basically. I
think I might change my name to Jordan, actually. That's subhanAllah. So Bismillah. So I had the same feeling as you, Abbas, to go right back to the beginning of just before the stream, we had these messages about advising if this is an appropriate thing to do. And, there's a very strong urge, and I think probably most Muslims feel this, that on these topics we actually self-censor quite stringently. And one of the things is that we don't want to be misconstrued in what's being said. And probably because of this net that you're talking about, that there is this collective guilt that's given to Muslims. So if a Muslim does something, then somehow you're all complicit. And there is that sense of feeling that just stay quiet, stay out of the way, and maybe if somebody asks you directly, you can talk about it, but avoid having like a public discussion. And I think that maybe that's not and I think actually this is not the right thing to do. And I agree with Jordan that we probably need to talk about these things because it will clarify we as Muslims, the vast majority of Muslims, where the actual position lies. And of course, in Islam, you've mentioned it right from the beginning, there's no such thing as vigilantism. An individual cannot take the law into their own hands, even if it was a Muslim country run by Muslim laws. And most definitely not in a country that doesn't allow vigilantism, like any Western country also wouldn't allow this. Most countries in the world don't allow vigilantism. And vigilantism would be something like, the KKK who were taking they'll pick up somebody of a certain, background and they would lynch them. This is vigilantism, or, taking the law into your own hands in any violent way. We wouldn't allow this. Islam wouldn't allow it. So, and also there's another principle in Islam, which is a very basic principle. And we've spoken about this before, probably a few years ago. And that principle is that the end never justifies the means. And what that means is that you can't just do whatever you think you can do to try and right a wrong, and that mechanism be a wrong way. So you can't do something bad to even achieve what you think is a good outcome. And this is definitely somebody killing somebody else is the wrong way to go about it, because you couldn't. This is not a law enforcing agency acting. This is not the government acting. This is an individual killing somebody else. Now we can talk about the circumstances behind it, but that's basically the Islamic position. This wouldn't be something that would be allowed. So the question that comes in: why was I feeling nervous about talking? Why is that the case? Why is it that I have to? And it's because of that. I am assuming that most people would put me in the bracket, all Muslims in the bracket, of all being somehow complicit. And then there's this pressure to start, and we've all done this. Even in this, we've done this by saying, obviously, this is wrong. But the reason we're having to say that is because for some people, it's not obvious. And it's a contradiction in terms. So we start by saying, oh, of course, Islam doesn't allow. And the of course is not for Muslims, because we know this. The of course is for the people who have bought into the narrative that you were talking about, Jordan, that, there is this, somehow there's a complicit. And we've got a great stream coming up next week, particularly on this topic. And I'd advise everyone to sort of tune into that, because we'll go into that particular topic a bit more detail. Professor Todd Green's coming on, and who discusses this topic in depth. But I think the thing to talk about in this scenario is actually the bigger picture. What's happening? 20 years ago we didn't have this. If you went just back two decades, we weren't having this on the streets of Western European countries. These sorts of attacks. And so what's gone on, and what's going on in France in particular, that has led up to this? And what should we do as Muslims to try and sort of address some of these issues, so that for a few things can happen. That there aren't, in any group of people, you're going to get someone who is maybe an extreme in terms of their view, or mentally affected in some way, that they will act in a way that because of whatever they're perceiving to be happening towards them or their religion, in a way that is going to be rejected by the majority. So whether that's the guy who killed 52 Muslims in New Zealand, or whether that's this guy here who's killed somebody because of what's happening in terms of the publishing of the trial of the people who killed the Charlie Hebdo, the 17 people initially in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then the republication of the cartoons. Whatever he's perceiving, there's going to be people who will react in that violent way. So we need to sort of this is where probably the nervousness comes from. That people often mistake trying to understand with justification. And that's that's not happening. really, and and this is the thing that we're trying to understand the background of this, so that we can then talk about, okay, what's going on. This has really been painted about an issue of freedom of speech because this is where it all sprang from, and we can get into that in a little bit to see what's actually going on. But Jordan, what are your thoughts? I mean, did you feel that nervousness that Bas felt, or did you? How did you?
I did actually, and obviously we've been advised. I mean, to be honest, when I did my stream, I didn't think twice about it, and to be honest, I thought my stream was a beautiful stream, and it just ended up that way because. And what I thought about after is I had many sisters come on, and firstly they were saying they're really, they're gutted this has happened, and then they're explaining how actually they are the victims after this. So, and I think people need to be very mindful that as Muslims, not only are you connected to it, by people asking you to condemn it, but then particularly the sisters are out there on the streets in the front line of hate, and obviously there were a couple of there was an Islamophobic attack in France on Sunday. That no doubt in my mind had some kind of effect of all of this. So I think, and that's why I kind of want to speak about it as well and make people realize that it may be very easy slip of their tongue, but I think they need to realize it is actually the Muslims that are the week after a terrorist attack is Muslims are actually the ones that are going to be receiving the sort of hate.
But isn't it interesting, Jordan, that if Christians were running a stream and they were going to talk about lynchings that the Ku Klux Klan did, where they killed thousands of people, I think lynching mobs in America were as late as the 50s or 60s or whatever. I mean, it was pretty late in terms of history, right? I don't think they would have to start explaining why Christianity doesn't allow this, and and they used to put crosses in people's front lawns and set the crosses on fire. They used to have crosses on their white cloaks and what have you, right? And yet they wouldn't. I don't think they would have to first say, in Christianity the Bible condemns this and the Bible says this, and it would be just accepted. It would be understood. Yeah. And yet this narrative that has been created by the media, by far right, the hate groups, people like Bannon, who pumped in like $100 million or something worth of money to these hate groups to sort of permeate this cancer through society, but it just shows how successful it's been, where people who are law-abiding citizens, are practicing, or at least trying to be good practicing Muslims, inshallah, but we're having to talk about how Islam doesn't allow these things, or how the Quran doesn't allow these things, how 99.99% of us, or even 99.999% of us wouldn't even dream of doing something. But what I'm trying to say is that other people wouldn't have to justify this.
No, I agree. And Abbas, I'm as a white man, no one's ever asked me to condemn the New Zealand attack or a lot of these white nationalist things, extreme white crimes. I've never once had to answer for anyone else. But as a Muslim, all of a sudden I have been linked, by many people to all of a sudden these extreme acts. So
Imran, I mean, the question really arises as to, you alluded to the fact that we certainly were not here 20 years ago and 30 years ago. I think the whole picture in Europe was a completely different scenario, especially when it comes to what is perceived to be terrorism done by people who profess to be Muslims. And I choose those words very carefully because if you look at the statistics, and I'm talking about hard data now, from people like Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago, if you look at Scott Atran and his work in relation to terrorism, in relation to, these young men and the things that they've done around the world, joining ISIS or whatever it might be. If you look at leaked reports from MI5 or the CIA or the FBI or whatever, it's consistently and constantly widely agreed, looking at the data, that the motivations are often geopolitical.
Yes.
It's about, you've bombed my country, or you've bombed my brother's country, or whatever it might be. But it's a geopolitical issue, even though sometimes they do cite religion. And this is like in the vast majority of cases, And yet we're in a situation today, 30 years on, where we're seeing these acts now unfold. So really the question arises, Islam's been around for 14 centuries. So if one argues it's Islam, it's Muslims, it's Islam, then clearly why was it not happening 40 years ago, 50 years ago? The UK had Europe had millions of Muslims in Europe. I think France has the biggest population in Europe of over 10 or 12 million Muslims living in France, right? And certainly 30, 40 years ago, there were millions of Muslims in Europe. But we weren't seeing these things, right? So the fact that we are seeing these things now, Imran, what's your take on it? Why is it happening?
That's a really complicated question. And I think some people might find it objectionable. And I think I've just reading through some of the comments of the comparison between the Klan and people think that we're comparing that to what's happened in Paris, and they missed the point. So the point being made here with that, if some minority act in a certain way, you don't tar the majority with that guilt.
Yeah.
And this is the point that was being made here. So the fact that this person, who's a Muslim, who's done this act, killed somebody, and we're saying that this is unjustified, and it's Islamically as well, which is more importantly for us, Islamically unjustified, but also legally unjustified. That this is a wrong thing, but that guilt, then the guilt of that should not be then spread amongst the Muslims, or Muslims shouldn't be held accountable for them. So that was the comparison directly.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what happens. Unfortunately, what happens is that you do get this sort of tarring everybody with the same brush.
Yeah,
and it's only for the negative things. So there's something that we've mentioned this before in our discussions, and in our drives backwards and forwards from Speaker's Corner, that when it comes to Muslims and actually minorities in general, but we're talking about Muslims here, that we generalize the negative and we specify the positive. And what we mean by that is if a Muslim were to do something good, it will, and if it's reported, I mean, usually it's probably not reported, but if it is reported, it's somehow specified to that individual, and that individual is made out to be an exception to the rule almost. Oh, look at this great Muslim person who's done this, giving away food or whatever that might be. So that's it, and it's taken away almost from the Muslim bit is almost sort of tagged on. It's not really even mentioned. It's just someone who's sort of doing a great thing. But if that same individual were to do something negative, it's generalized to being, look at this Muslim, and you'll get things like devout Muslim or something that highlights the importance of religion in this particular case.
Yeah.
Now it doesn't have to be religion; it can be ethnicity. We had the same thing with the Pakistani men grooming people in the north, and there's hundreds of thousands of Pakistani men in the country, and you take like 8 or 9 of them and you make that the rule.
Yeah,
and this is generalizing the negative. So this shouldn't happen. Just as I wouldn't blame Jordan for another white person doing something bad, just as I wouldn't say because one black person was stealing that all black people would be free. This is the type of narrative. So same goes here. If somebody who happens to be of a Muslim background decides to do a criminal act, this shouldn't be then generalized to the Muslims specifically, and which is what happens. And this is the motivation behind this question. Do you condemn this? Almost the first question that people are asked. So I just wanted to address that, because people often raise this as an issue, like you're making these comparisons and not for the same thing. And what's being alluded to here is this is all about freedom of speech, that Muslims are being somehow extra sensitive in this department. Why are you not accepting that we can say these things? And now so the question really goes back to, well, okay, let's go right back to the beginning. There's two things to in my mind, there's two things to work out here. What is the status of play of the societies within that particular country? So what I mean by that is, the Muslim societies, the Jewish societies, communities within that society. Yeah, I'm using the word society incorrectly. So communities. And the second thing is actually, how is this freedom of speech, which is valued by, the vast majority of countries in the world, how is this implemented? and then you'll get to maybe some of the idea, and we can put that into sort of the bigger picture. So we can get into that a little bit. But do you think that's a reasonable approach to this, or is there another way of going through this?
I think there is, and I think what you touch on there is very important, which is that a good act is not because they're following Islam and because they're good Muslims, but it's because he's a good person, he's a nice guy, he's a nice girl. She said she's a nice girl, she's a nice woman, whatever, you know. And if something bad happens, then yes, it's like, oh my God, this is the Islamic faith. You know, this person is representing Islam. And you touched on the issue with the Rotherham grooming gangs. And before somebody comes in the comments and says, oh yeah, you would say that, but 83% of the grooming gangs were Asian Pakistani Muslim men, you know. What you fail to appreciate when you say things like that is that 100% of grooming rings were white. You see? So the question that you need to ask yourself is that if you have a headline that's factually correct, because the definitions fall slightly differently, and so your net, in effect, captures different groups of people. And if the headlines were all over the radio, newspapers, the TV channels and everyone, and they kept saying 100% of grooming rings are white men, and most of them have a Christian name, so they're Christian, that clearly is going to affect the way people start viewing white men, because they associate that heinous act with a group of people. And so I think it was Ella Cockbain, the psychologist, I hope I got her name right, and she did a detailed study on the statistics that were conducted, you know, and the conclusions that were driven. And she was highly critical because she said, look, this is a subset of a subset that you've sort of narrowed down a definition to sort of almost deliberately capture a particular group, when in fact, if you look at the whole picture of grooming gangs and you know, of child abuse, it's a completely different picture. But it's this type of thing. So you're quite right, actually, is that this portrayal, and, you know, I just made an example of how it's wrong to associate the crimes, like you said, of a few to the majority. And you've already got somebody in the comments saying that I don't know how you can make this comparison with what happened. I mean, it's just, people are like literally looking for that one word or that one statement that could potentially be loosely interpreted to be something negative, and they'll take it negatively. And I just think that's not a really honest way of having a discussion about anything. You know, what would you think, Jordan, on that?
I think you're right. I think you can't really get any more insincere than the grooming gang sort of statistics. And, you know, so as we know, the Quillian report was completely the way they kind of manipulated it. And look, again, we're not justifying anything. You know, we'd condemn the Muslims, the Pakistani Muslims that were doing it. But it's so clear when you look at the police records that, like you said, Abbas, it's a subcategory of a subcategory. So I think the subcategory was 4%, and then the category of that was, so we're talking about 0.something% of a crime. Now, if you really care about the victims, should you really just, you know, should you be using a minority of them to push an agenda? And I think when I see it, it's really, I get really angry with it, because I feel that they are just using these abuse cases to push an agenda, and it's hard to watch. And I think for me as well, and I know, Imran, you were perhaps talking about France as well. And I think that is a good place to say that sort of the freedom of speech. And, you know, I'm finding as a Muslim, people are trying to control how I think. I'm not allowed to be offended. You know, I'm not allowed to be, and any action I do that's wrong will suddenly be representative on all my brothers and sisters around me. And like you quite rightly said, Abbas, that's not really attributed to anyone else. You know, and I don't talk too much about Speaker's Corner, but I noticed that in Speaker's Corner. You know, I noticed that people say that if you go there, people say the most vilest thing. People are desecrating Qurans at Speaker's Corner. They're getting very little reaction, but the couple of reactions that's there are getting, you know, completely condemned, and look at all the Muslims, and you know, no one is saying anything about the Christian behavior. The Muslims are all lumped into one bracket. And it's bizarre, and I think that is something that's happening, you know, in France as well, and it is a global thing that I'm noticing.
Yeah. And I think obviously I want to move away from the Paris incident per se and take the conversation a little bit further on, Imran, and just this general perception that is had out there about freedom of speech means that you can, in effect, say whatever you like, unless it's explicit in terms of encouraging murder or killing or something like that. Now, would you say that was equal when it comes to different communities? Because I feel that there's a huge inequality in terms of freedom of speech. So, for example, certain countries make it illegal, for example, to desecrate the flag, right? So
France is one of those.
Right, France is one of them, right? So clearly there are some freedoms that are curtailed, that are ring-fenced, that you can't go beyond, okay? Because as a legal system, you recognize that there's always going to be a small number of people within any society, okay, religious or irreligious, it doesn't matter, who, if you push and you push and you push and you push, they may have mental illness, they may have, they may have other issues going on, post-traumatic stress or whatever, because they've come from a war zone or whatever, right? And people don't always act rationally. They don't always act reasonably, I mean, for example, I would, and again, this is not to excuse anything, because of course we wouldn't do that. But what I'm trying to say is that I wouldn't go into a certain area knowing that there's a Pakistani community there and start desecrating their flag there, or start talking about their prime minister being a pedophile or something like that, because the chances are people are going to get irritated and they're going to react. Now, is the reaction always going to be legal? Is it always going to be rational? Is it always going to be what most people would deem as moral? Possibly not. There's always going to be a minority of people who are going to behave incredibly badly. We've got situations at football games where, if you follow the wrong team and you say the wrong thing, there can be a brawl and people can get stabbed, people can get killed. Now, clearly, we're not comparing the two, but I'm just saying that there's always going to be criminality within any group. And I just think that if you're going to award freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which we would all argue are noble things, okay, to have freedoms to be able to express yourself is something that we should all fight for, something that we should all be, supporting. But there has to be certain limits, I believe, where we don't lose our common decency. We don't lose our integrity for one another. And if we know, for example, and again, I'm not necessarily speaking about the Paris attacks here, I'm talking about just generally, rules of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, it should not be applied in an unequal way to people. So on the one hand, if in Germany you deny the Holocaust, it's illegal. You'll be arrested. If you say the things that you say about Muslims, about Jews, for example, you'd be immediately arrested for committing acts of anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not saying that we should relax those laws and allow people to be anti-Semitic, but at the same time, why am I not afforded those rights? Why am I not afforded the same dignity, the same level of respect?
So I think you really raise a really valid point, and I think underlying this is the question, and we can go into the sort of the setup in France in a bit, but what's freedom of speech for? What was the purpose of it? What are your thoughts, Jordan? Because that's probably the underlying question. What is the purpose of the freedom of speech?
I think for me, my understanding of freedom of speech is set up, like Abbas said, for a noble, for expressing yourself. And I think it's healthy in a society to hear what people's real, what they think, and you should be able to express that. And we know from history that repressing things isn't always good. So yeah, that is definitely, and I think there is this kind of notion that Muslims can't take criticizing and stuff like that. And that's not my experience. And I think the stuff Abbas is talking about, and probably the stuff I'm assuming we're going to talk about, Imran, is the kind of dehumanizing kind of rhetoric and the real abhorrent stuff that is allowed to say. I remember politicians a couple of years ago saying that Islam is an infestation, they're rats, it's a death cult. And I thought, you can't even say things like that about gay people in this country. How on earth are you saying it about Muslims? And I think that's a differentiation I want. We attend Speaker's Corner, so we can stand in the face of people criticizing our religion. But I certainly want to stand against this double standard that Muslims can just be, trod on, and they're just supposed to just kind of stand there and sort of, just understand it as freedom of speech when, we talk about, pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or desecrating the Quran, or things that we would be insulted at, And I think back to the poppies being burnt. I mean, you could easily just say it's only a poppy, burning the poppy. What's the big deal? But I remember that a lot of the same people that are telling the Muslims it's only freedom of speech were quite happy for Tommy to form the EDL. We're quite happy for those, that incident to create a whole race, a hateful kind of almost initiative against Islam, that we need to ban Islam and we need to get, and that was over, burning poppies. But, like you said quite rightly, Abbas, and I hope I've answered your question, Imran. I know I've been dabbling a bit. There's a clear double standard. I see it at Speaker's Corner. I see it in my country, and I see it in France. And to be honest, you see it even further.
No, I agree with you, mashallah. You're absolutely right. So it is something that freedom of expression is important, and it's important for exactly the things that you outlined. Now, what I was trying to get to, which is exactly what you said, but a bit more specific, is that freedom of speech is always about the ability to speak truth to power. Because in the time before this was a value that was upheld. If you sort of said something against the king, well, that's it. You're executed. We'll kill all your family. We'll kill everyone. Everyone's gone. So you wouldn't speak up against a ruler who's ruling unjustly or maybe tyrannically. And this was the concept behind this. So the idea was that it gave you the right to give your expression to those in power without having a negative consequence to yourself. And that's where the underlying idea, concept of it came from, which is a noble concept. I mean, the Prophet, peace be upon him, this reminds us of a hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that one of the greatest struggles jihad was the word struggle. One of the greatest struggles is the word of truth to the tyrant ruler. And this is really just in a nutshell, the basic concept of being able to speak to someone in power without a negative consequence to yourself. Now, it's morphed over the time to something else, and as you were alluding to, and as the master was alluding to, it's become the idea now that I'm getting is that anyone can say anything they like to you, no matter how bad it is, and you're not allowed to react. And like you said, the right to feel offended. I mean, I can be offended by somebody and still actually, be reasonable with them and be friendly with them, and I don't have to take it in a negative way. But this is really the problem. The problem is that it's become the way to test freedom of speech now is not to go to the ruler and say, you guys are, this austerity is decimating the society, or that, our health service is crumbling and the people who need help are not able to get it, or to criticize them in that way, or in a way that's even maybe more personal. It's now become the way to test it is actually we're going to, offend you and everyone that we can offend, and there seems to be focus on certain groups particularly, and you have to accept it and accept it submissively. Don't respond to that. Now, in terms of, and this is what you were saying about, in terms of having a cohesive society, a society that actually brings the communities together so we can sit down and have conversations where we disagree with each other, still have a cup of tea and still walk away with our views without, if they changed or not changed wouldn't make a difference. We're getting polarization. We're getting people, trying to say that thing to you which is going to make you respond, like you mentioned in the Speaker's Corner, Brother Jordan. And that's a problem, because we don't learn about each other like this. All we learn is that this is the button that I need to push to get this reaction from this individual.
Yeah.
And we end up walking away from each other. Now, if we want to learn, if we want to know whose concept of the world is the correct concept, whose religion is the most likely to be the religion that is the correct religion, are atheists, rather than having these conversations, we simply go into this thing about, offensive, how to be the most offensive person you can be. And, the ayah that you put up, Abbas, a little bit earlier on about, this is in the sixth chapter of the Quran, verse 108. In the beginning part of the ayah, it says, "And do not insult they who invoke other than Allah, lest they insult Allah in enmity without knowledge." So we're giving a direct Quranic statement.
Yeah.
That if you have someone who doesn't believe they don't believe in Allah, they believe in other things, never insult those things. Why? And the reason is given in case they unknowingly do the same to Allah. So we have a Quranic standard of not being offensive, and we're talking about religion, which is, for some people, there is this concept that religion is one of those things you can just change whenever you feel like it. But the reality is that if you believe something to be true, how can you delude yourself and do something opposite to that?
Yeah, great point.
Your conscience is that strong. Like, if I believe that if I take this thing I will die, why would I then do that, going against my belief? So your belief is a very powerful thing, and I think it's as strong as something like your ethnicity and these sorts of things is very, very powerful. In fact, I view myself as a Muslim before any other identity that I give myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're secondary to me.
Yeah.
And which is one of the things that people don't seem to understand. So the purpose for freedom of speech, which is speaking truth to power, seems to have completely gone. In fact, the powerful get away with everything virtually without being recriminated, and we're allowed to sort of have a few protests here and there, unless you're in France, and you're one of the yellow jacket people, that you'll get sort of a riot police attacking you. And we can go into the freedom of speech specifically in France, because there is a big issue with the double standards, as you mentioned, about what happens in France, because a lot happens there. But the great concept of the freedom of speech and the reason for it to exist seems to have been completely diluted now, and it's really about how much can we offend the other person, and that's the shame. That's the shame of it. I wonder what do you guys think about that? I
think for me, Imran, sorry Abbas, I got a big.
Go ahead.
Is that I've spoken to people on panels. I've spoken to people at the park now. I don't want to keep talking about it, but that's where obviously a lot of my conversations take place, where I'm having this conversation, and there seems to be this lack of kind of care for others. So you bring up examples. What if someone insulted your mother? Is it freedom of speech? Oh, it's fine. And I'm just thinking, I feel it makes me happier to be Muslim, because I feel like, hang on a minute, I don't want to do any of that stuff. I don't want to insult your Bible. I don't want to insult any of that, because I have a standard that I have to uphold. And look, if I do that, I'm acting wrongly, and I understand that. But I have these conversations with people that are fairly decent people, but there's this kind of modern concept of freedom of speech that it suddenly feels uncivilized. It feels like you've thrown all of your kind of class, manners, and respect, your British values, you've thrown them out the door, just for this kind of, I don't know whether it's an agenda or what it is, but this freedom of speech that, I can say anything about your prophet, peace be upon him, and you should just stand there and take it, because you live in a civilized England. You need to just take it on the chin. And I just think, where is that ever a British value? Where is and like I say, I hope that people get the message that, obviously for me it's Islam first, but I hope people get the message that we need to up our standard, our sort of character and game. We all live in a society together. I don't want to see any communities dehumanized or othered or targeted. And I'm very careful for that reason in what I say. And it would be nice to have that back. It would be nice to have that same standard back. And at the moment, I don't see it.
It's quite interesting, Jordan. You said we can say anything about your prophet, but Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but you must just take it because of freedom of speech, but don't say anything about my football team.
Yeah, that's right.
Otherwise we're going to have words.
That's right.
And it's just this. It's almost an insanity, really. This bipolar type of interpretation of what freedom of speech and freedom of expression actually mean. And it almost disengages from the reality of how human beings are, and how somehow Muslims have to behave in a certain way, but the rest of humanity can get triggered with this, that, and the other. So it's this double standards. But Imran, I'd like to allude to something about standing up to power. And what comes to mind is that, and we're talking about 14 centuries ago. The second Caliph, Umar Khattab radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him. While he's standing up in the masjid, in the mosque, after the cloth was distributed, the amana from the treasures of the community, everyone got a piece of cloth. And Umar Khattab radiallahu anhu was a very tall, very strong, very big man. And one of the companions stood up. And this is, by the way, Umar Khattab is, peace be radiallahu anhu, he's the Caliph at the time. So he is the ruler of all of the Muslims, and he was known to be a very strong man, And one of the companions stood up and he said, how comes your fabric is bigger than all of our fabric? And what does he do as a ruler, right? As a person who's in charge of the military, in charge of the state, in charge of the finances? Does he say, shut up, how dare you question me? Do you know who you're talking to? No. He said, can you just give me a moment so I may answer? And he said that my son gave me his share. And that's why I managed to have a larger garment than the rest of you. And the man, he sat down, and this was the way that so when we talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, this is not new to Muslims. Now you show me an example like this in the 7th century, where another ruler, a military ruler with the sole control of his entire army and nation, where he could have been questioned in this way in the 7th century. So we've had this tradition in Islam. This is nothing new to us, but we have limits within, as Muslims, that we cannot destroy churches or synagogues or interfere with other people's worship or say derogatory things about other people's gods, even if it's pagan, even if it's idolatry. We're not permitted to insult people in that way, because these are the limits that Allah has set upon us. And they're good limits because they mean that society operates in a more harmonious way, in a way whereby we don't look for reasons to humiliate one another, to ridicule one another, because ridiculing and humiliating somebody is not, as the noble act of the noble concession of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, what it was actually there for, what it was designed for. This is unfortunately a butchering of, a slaughtering of, a corrupting of something that's very noble, and using it to bludgeon or to attack somebody. That's not, I would hope, not a freedom that any of us would actually be fighting for. But unfortunately, things seem to be that going that way, whereby people say, "Oh, but it's just words," And one of the things is that reading the Todd Green, Assistant Professor Todd Green's book, and the stream that we're going to do in a week's time or whatever,
I miss it.
Sorry.
Don't miss it, I'm saying.
No, exactly. Don't miss it. Yeah, absolutely. In that book, Todd, Assistant Professor Todd Green, he gives a quote of a rabbi, and it's an interesting quote, and it actually did stand out. And it was a very simple quote. He simply said, "Words make worlds." So, in other words, it does matter what you say.
Yeah.
And it also brought me back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when one of the companions asked the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, will we be held accountable for even the words, the things that we say? And the Prophet ﷺ said, may your mother be bereaved, Murad. And this was just a term in Arabic. Is there anything that topples a man onto his face greater than the harvest of his tongue? In other words, what you say does matter. I'll give you just a sort of an example, like, where upsetting people or perhaps being disrespectful to people. I mean, I learned a few years back that in Thailand, if you sit in front of somebody facing them with the soles of your feet facing them, it's regarded as very disrespectful. Now, I thought to myself, if I ever am in a situation, this is weird. I thought if I'm ever in a situation where I go to Thailand or I'm in Thailand or have Thai guests or whatever, I've got to make sure that I never do that, because I really wouldn't want to offend somebody. Now, do I think it's offensive? No, I don't. I just think it's, I think it has no relevance really, But because I know that it has relevance to that individual, I hope as an attempt or trying to be a good human being, that I would not want to offend someone. Why would I want to offend somebody just because it's not important to me?
Great point.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's about knowing that if something's going to hurt somebody and it really is upsetting them, why would I want to fight for the right to be able to do that? It just seems rather odd to me,
Yeah, and I think I personally think, and like I say, I don't want to talk. I always have to clarify that, firstly, obviously we condemn what not condemn what happened, but I'm not. Everything I say, I almost feel like I'm turning on eggshells, because what I wanted to say is I want to know why this particular story, shook the whole world and made headlines everywhere, and why everyone's talking about it. And the reason why I say that is, I'll be honest, people are dropping bombs places that, I know this is a decapitation, so it's an awful story. But there are things happening all around the world. Why is this story everyone talking about it? And I believe this story is pushed further than may be necessary, because it's trying to say that Islam is against freedom of speech. It's for me, I don't know what you think, Imran, as well. It's painting it as, the Muslims can't handle, any insults against them, and this is what happens, and so I don't know what your opinion is on that, Imran, because I kind of feel that and look, we've said on here that various communities are protected, and we support that, so we currently support the way things are for other people. All that we're really talking about is consistency across, and I think, we pointed out double standards in France, for example, and I think that's where the conversation is for me, and I think the reason why I responded on my stream is I feel that what is happening is there's a message being out there telling people subconsciously that if you dare say anything about Islam, if you dare to do anything, this is what might happen. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Imran.
So you both made really, really powerful points, mashallah, and I completely agree. The only thing that I was going to actually just suggest, just also add in now, is a little bit specifically about the idea that what freedom of speech actually is like in France, because one of the things that's put forward about this idea you can do, and Charlie Hebdo specifically is a magazine. It's called Satire, and satire has always been about people mocking those in power. And it's that same thing. The freedom of speech comes from that. You can speak about those in power or to those in power without any repercussions. Now, if you reverse that, if you are in power and you then mock and vilify the weak in your society, whoever they happen to be, whether they're black people or whether they're Muslims, and Charlie Hebdo has this sort of, they have this sort of focus on specifically Muslims, and we know from the past that they've self-centered from, in fact they didn't sack one of their long-standing cartoonists, I think his name was Seen, or Sine, I don't know how you pronounce his name, because what he did was actually he did a caricature insulting the son of the former president Nicolas Sarkozy and his wife, and this is like a double standard.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
So this is not even. I mean, and that's amazing. I mean, imagine that. So that a political figure is being caricatured, and they fired their cartoonist over this. And that's actually what satire is meant to be: is that you go after the people in power. And then there were other cases in the courts. For example, we had, there was a company that made a Jesus-based clothing advert, and it was taking them, as if I would, as a Muslim, would find it offensive to depict Jesus in the way that it was depicting him. It was talking, it was showing him in a way that wasn't good. But the court ruled. This is the French court now, who the upholders of this concept of freedom of speech said that the way that this shirt was being advertised, it was a gratuitous and aggressive act of intrusion on people's innermost beliefs. I can imagine that statement. A gratuitous and aggressive act of intrusion, I'm quoting the judge here, on people's innermost beliefs. Wow. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Stunning.
Isn't that and that was when I read that, I was really surprised by this. I thought, wow, this is a understandable statement. It's about cohesion within society, and for cohesion in society, you wouldn't go and make gratuitous and aggressive attacks of intrusion about things that are sensitive.
And how right the statement's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely correct. I completely agree with the judge. But you see, it goes against this idea of freedom of speech is this thing that you can just say whatever you like to whoever and offend them in any way whatsoever. And that is what what freedom is. And there are lots of other cases like this. We know of, there was what was that? I can't remember. There was that comedian. What was his name? Dieudonné. I think. And he did he got convicted and fined in France because he did what was he do? He talked about the Holocaust being some sort of that it's overly thought about. I think he called it memorial pornography or something, which is not a good thing to say. I mean, I disagree with him, but he got convicted and fined for that in France for expressing himself. They had another case where this is a footballing case. So Jordan, you probably know everything about this. This is when Anelka and this same comedian, they did that anti-Zionist sign, which was taken as they said it was a reverse Nazi salute, but actually it was about anti-Zionism, and that, there was repercussions for them. So we have lots of cases within France of speech not being allowed. I mean, if you burn the French flag, for example, you can be convicted of that. If you're offensive towards the president themselves, I don't know exactly how that wording of that is. This is prosecutable. So freedom of speech is curtailed, and it's understandable. I mean, even in Islam, we have this thing about do not say to those people who worship other than Allah anything. Don't insult them because they may inadvertently insult Allah. So we have this idea also that we need to curtail our speech to allow the harmonious running of society. But it doesn't mean that you can't disagree. I mean, we had open air in Baghdad in the Muslim heyday. We had open air debates with people who are atheists or people of other religions. I mean, St. John of Damascus. I mean, where was he writing his anti-Islamic books? He was writing in the heart of the Muslim lands. And he wasn't killed or anything for these. So the idea that you can't have a rigorous intellectual discussion, sit down and say, look, I think this about your prophet, I think this about your religion. Great, let's do that. But that's not the same as gratuitous insult. And this is where we lose the freedom of speech becomes, rather than a noble thing and a great thing, and even satire, rather than becoming a great thing and a noble thing, becomes just a way of causing as much offense to a minority within your society, rather than actually about trying to improve intellectual debate and discussion and learning. And this is where the problem lies. So the satire from Charlie Hebdo isn't satire if it's aimed at the weakest within your society. And we know from the state of the Muslims within France that they are almost I would say second-class citizens. I mean, they can't express themselves in their religious dress, for example, in public, so they can't go to. If you wear a hijab, for example, if you have a daughter who wears hijab, she can't go to university wearing the hijab. She can't go to school wearing the hijab. Any public building like the library, you couldn't take it. If you went into a hospital, you'd have to. I mean, imagine that. Now, and if you're on the streets, you can't actually wear the niqab. They've banned that as well. Even though a tiny fraction of the Muslim women wear this was banned. And
did you know, Imran, that they have to remove their niqab and put on a face mask?
Subhanallah, yeah. you'll get fined for wearing a niqab, but you won't get for wearing a face mask. And a lot of face coverings are now just something just across the face. So
can I ask you, does that apply to Sikhs? Do they have to remove their turbans then? And does that apply to Jewish people who wear the cap? Do they have to take that off as well?
So I would hope it does, because then that would make it a little bit fairer. But I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that.
I don't think it does, to be honest.
Sure, but I would hope it does, because then at least you're trying to be consistent. But
to be honest, I would hope that it doesn't. But I would hope that it wouldn't for Muslims either. That's the point.
Yeah, sure. No, I completely agree with you. But you're missing the.
For example, sorry, I sort of took you out of mid-flow and apologize. So for example, I think, for anything to be truly considered to be just and fair, it has to be equal. But if you afford it to someone, you don't afford it to others, that is inherently unjust and unfair. And one of the things, of course, is that, look, I completely sympathize with the nation of France to be outraged and really upset and go on marches and have candles, because yes, of course, when one of your countrymen, if it happened in England, I'd be outraged regardless of whoever committed the crime, because it's a horrible, heinous thing, But we've got to also have some introspection here, because how many candles were burnt for the 1.5 million Algerians that were killed because of French involvement within Algeria to quash the movement for democracy and to move away from French, control? How many people even know that the figure was 1.5 million? How many people mourned for those people? And to me, it just seems that, if we're going to have our humanity, then our humanity has to extend to all human beings, not just if they're white, not just if they're brown, not just if they're Muslim, not just if they're atheist, not just if they're French or Italian, but our empathy and our hearts should actually ache for all lives. Now, I'm not saying that we don't all, perhaps become somewhat heightened in our concern when it's somebody close to us, if it's a family member or it's somebody in our area or district or in our country, that is understandable. But the disparity between that concern and complete disregard for the hundreds of thousands or millions that have been killed by our own governments, right? And in this case, we're talking about the French government and the situation in Algeria. Okay. And there's no concern. There's no mourning about that. There's no recognition. I mean, the Prime Minister of France, Macron, he first said about the situation in what had happened in Algeria as a crime against humanity. I think he said something along those lines. But then he later retracted that statement. And he said, all I'm doing is acknowledging that it happened. I'm not accepting guilt and I'm not passing judgment, basically. In other words, I'm going to stay neutral. 1.5 million people have died, and you want to say that you're going to stay neutral on the issue? I just don't think that this level of, the blood of a Muslim, the blood of a non-Muslim, the blood of a Christian, the blood of an atheist, in our eyes, until we start viewing that with equality and consideration, we're not really going to, I think, advance as a society. And I think we're always going to be shackled to this sort of like very backward, medieval, tribal type of, assessment of one another. And I think it's just, to me, it's a lack of intelligence and integrity on an individual if he thinks another person is less human than he is or than she is because they follow a particular faith or because they have they're a particular nationality. I think that really does reflect on the person's level of intelligence, quite frankly, because I don't think you need to think very hard to realize that those type of sentiments are clearly wrong. You don't need to dig very deeply to find the data that actually goes against a lot of these far right and stereotypical views that are being sort of pushed, like, as I say, like a cancer into society. You don't have to do very much work to come to that realization. And the fact that either you're not willing to, or that you're incapable of doing that in the 21st century, I think really does speak volumes.
So I just want to address something very quickly. So we've had somebody make a comment, and it's really, this is the problem. So someone's just said, and this is, I'm not going to put the comment up actually, but because I scrolled past, I don't want to scroll up to find it. They said, and I'm trying to quote it, paraphrasing it now because I can't see it. That it's the murder in the French in Paris is okay because of because of French's colonial past.
Particular statement.
Absolutely, and this is the problem here. Now, this is what I wanted to highlight this because sometimes people don't listen to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, and I think this is where these nuances. So this is where I said right at the beginning that sometimes trying to make a point to understand something is taken as justification.
Yeah.
Now, we've all said right from the beginning that there is no justification. This was wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And people are still seeing it that way. Now, what you were saying, and that your point that you were making is when you're pointing a finger at somebody, 3 fingers are pointing back at you.
Mm.
And that's the point that you were making. And now this person is doing exactly the same thing.
Mm.
How dare you Muslims use nuance? How dare you Muslims even say anything? We should just be up here condemning it. How dare we? Yeah.
So, and the surprising thing is, sorry, Imran, and the surprising thing is, even when we're not in a heightened situation where there's emotions running high and things like that, the second you start talking about the injustice that's committed by your own government, the first question that you get asked is, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go back to your own country? And you think to yourself, well, I was born here. I've been here for over 50 years now.
I think Jordan should go back to his own country, I think.
Right? Yeah. My kids are born, my kids are born here. They're, my eldest son is like in his mid-20s or whatever, right?
Mm.
So how many generations must we be here before we are entitled to have the same level of introspection and perhaps criticism of our government that a white person, can do with absolute impunity, without the care, without the worry of being accused of being, go back to your own country, as it were, whatever, right? But as a person of color, because you can recognize Abbas is clearly not English, as in, through many, many generations, let's say, living in England.
I thought you were using a sunbed, Abbas. I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Trump. Yeah, a little bit more orange if that were happening. But the point here is that it's like, so as a Muslim and as an Asian, or as an ethnic minority, you mustn't say these things because you're not entitled to. You can't have an opinion. You just have to be grateful that you're here.
Yeah, it's funny. I've there's actually someone in the chat now who's campaigned for me almost to be deported. And I think, wow. And in fact, he's actually from an Asian background. But because of my Islamic beliefs, I'm all of a sudden not compatible with this country and therefore need to be shipped off somewhere else. So it's subhanAllah.
I think the problem here, Jordan, is that this narrative of this clash of civilizations, has been permeated through these channels of hate, and I remember a few years back, it was Brother Shah Nawaz, and we were talking to Shah Nawaz about, and he was doing a discussion about why do people believe what they believe, and it was an interesting question, really, And he explained that, in psychology, because he studied psychology, and he said, we learned that there are two types of people. There are data-driven people, and there are concept-driven people. And the data-driven people are generally people who, wait for data, good evidence. And by evidence, guys, I don't mean Fox News and the Sun or the Daily Mail. I'm talking about data conducted by academics, right? And then they form their opinions as a consequence of the data, of the evidence, basically. And then you have a larger group, the vast majority of people who are concept-driven. So they already have very much predisposed or opinions that are fairly concrete. Muslims are bad. Islam is bad. Islam is medieval. Islam wants to take over our freedom. They already believe these things. And then what they do is exactly what that person just did, Imran. Rather than listen to what we're actually saying, their take on it is completely skewed to this, not to the discussion that we're clearly having here, right? I mean, I remember, just very quickly before I let you guys come in, I remember going on LBC radio, and I don't know, I can't remember what the conversation was, but I was just discussing something. And then afterwards, I was reading in these comments, people were saying, oh, this Abbas sounds like one of the 20,000, one of the 20,000 that are extremists. And I thought to myself, subhanAllah, you just can't have an opinion unless you agree with me. You either agree with me or you agree with the terrorists. And this sort of narrative, it to me is just shocking, really, how people can be so unintelligent, really, and to narrow it down to these two choices, polar opposite choices. Either you agree with me, all Muslims are bad, Islam is bad, Islam is backward. Either you agree with that, or you're one of the other. You're basically one of the terrorists. And I just can't understand this type of mentality, to be honest.
Yeah, I think like you guys said, you can't really have a balanced approach. I would say if we were to talk about, maybe things this country's done in the past wrong, if let's say you were to talk about, what's his name, Winston Churchill, and maybe mention some of the bad stuff he did, I don't think you could really speak to many English people without them bringing out the nuanced approach that maybe he saved from the Nazis, but they give you the other side. But like I say, as Muslims, you can't do that. You have to outwardly condemn. I know me and you, Imran, you've sort of almost schooled me on this point. I didn't used to actually believe this. I think when I used to actually think, we should just condemn everything that's bad. We should just go around condemning everything that's bad. But like I say, the double standard to the Muslims, it just isn't right. Other people are afforded that ability to give a balanced, nuanced approach. And particularly when you look at the nuance that's needed, like you guys quite rightly said, where was these attacks, more than 30 years ago? They were unheard of. So why can't you talk about the instability of the Middle East, the action, that maybe even this attack that we're talking about in France, the guy left a message for Macron, and he was linked to ISIS, and he came, 200 miles away to do the attack. This wasn't just some local Muslim that got offended. This was clearly politically driven, and therefore there should be nuance given to it. But like you say, I have looked at, around the internet at what people are saying about this, and quite often it is just viewed as, Islam's response to freedom of speech.
So this point about condemning. The question is, and we'll get into this probably next week, but I just want to. Yeah. The question is that who's asking you to condemn, and then who's being reassured by that condemning. Now, my neighbour, who I've known for many years, or the neighbours that live along the road where I live, they've known me since I was a young person, and since I moved into the area, and they would never say to me, "Oh, Imran, this happened. Do you condemn it?" Because they know me. They would just say, "Oh, it's a terrible thing." I say, "Yeah, it's a terrible thing. It shouldn't be happening, really." And because why? They know, as a Muslim, they've interacted with me. They know that I don't hold these views. They haven't bought into the narrative because of our interaction. But the people that are asking you tend to be those who hold the view that you are collectively culpable. So they'll say to you, You're a Muslim, Jordan. Oh, you're a traitor. Do you condemn this? Do you condemn this act? And what? No matter what you do, Jordan, however many times you say yes, it's absolutely terrible. And let me get my condemn app out. Let me just press the button a few times. And any new terrorist attack comes up, it will be on there, and I just press condemn, and it'll go out on all my social. They will never be reassured of your condemnation, because they still hold the view that you are culpable, because you're one of them.
Yeah.
And surely there are, obviously, in all the mosques, there's regular coffee mornings where all the terrorists get together and plan their next attacks, that we, with their PowerPoints and everything, because we all know about it, right?
It's disgraceful.
And this is really the issue. So my neighbor doesn't need reassuring, because they know us, and probably this is where the dawah comes in. It's why it's important to talk about this. We need to be interacting as Muslims with our neighbors, particularly our non-Muslim neighbors and our colleagues, and on these things, and not shy away from having the discussion. And this is one of the reasons why, despite our initial misgivings about doing this, it's important that we have the discussion, because really we're getting to the bottom of the matter.
Yeah.
Great point.
I remember it's probably about a year ago. So when the Iranian general was droned, I think, by America, and they killed him. I don't know if you remember that incident. And I really didn't even know the name of the guy. I didn't know nothing about him. But I phoned the radio station to have a chat, and it was LBC. It was at nighttime. And the presenter said to me, that he had read about this guy, and he was apparently a bad person. He'd done a lot of bad things, and really, he deserved what he got. My point simply was that we, as a civilized, claiming to be civilized nations, have to adhere to international law. And does international law allow us to just go and kill somebody because we feel that they've done bad things, right? And he said to me, do you condemn this person? And I said, why should I have to condemn him? I don't even know him. I don't even know his name. And he said, no, this was very interesting. He said to me, no, but I've read up about this person. He was a really horrible person. So I'm going to give you one more chance. Do you condemn this person? And I just thought to myself, hold on a second. I don't even know what this person has apparently done. I'm just talking about a principle here. Okay. And you're insisting that I condemn this individual on the pretext that you have done some homework on this individual. And that should be enough for me to have to condemn this individual. And I refused to do it. And I said, well, I'm sorry. I just think it's completely inappropriate that you're insisting that I have to condemn somebody that I don't even know. Why are you even asking me to do that? And I think this actually will follow very nicely to our stream next week with Todd Green, because his book, Presumed Guilty, why we should not ask Muslims to condemn terrorism, is exactly about this very subject. And I must say that actually, and I'm sorry if we're going into the book now, but reading that book actually really did open my eyes on so many things. It really, really did. Because I remember, Jordan, you and I had a discussion about this as well. And, we were talking about, what's wrong with just saying, look, we don't accept this, we condemn this, and let's move on with the discussion, And I said to you, after reading the book, and I thought to myself, you know what, perhaps before reading the book I might have swayed, I might have even agreed with you, but I tell you what, post reading that book, I think damn right, he's absolutely right. Why should I be asked to condemn anything, quite frankly? Why should there be this assumption of guilt that I have to somehow counter by saying that, I condemn it so people won't think that I am part? Why should I have to do that? And I really did open my eyes, and I really do implore people to join us, inshallah, for the next stream, with Todd Green. I mean, this gentleman has done a lot of work for combating Islamophobia. You know, he's been on all of the well-known news networks, from Fox News to CNN to Al Jazeera to Canadian networks, to written tons of articles, and actually has written many books as well. And we're going to sort of go through some of his work next week. So we would really sort of we would love for you to join us on that discussion, because I think it's going to be a really, really important one.
Yeah. Look, we've plugged it about 10 times now, so I think you guys should get the message. And I think
1,000 views.
I definitely, and Imran would tell you, is I went full 360 really. I think before reading that, and I think that's why Imran, may I reward you, gave me the book. I think he just said
180, Jordan, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 180 actually. Yeah, 360.
You started.
Yeah, so 180. Fair point. And I think it got to the point where Imran just said, "Shut up, Jordan. Just read this book." Read it. And I don't know what you guys think as well. I think for me, it also put me in the shoes of a born Muslim who's maybe all his life had to condemn this. You know, whereas I've kind of stepped into Islam a couple of years ago. And so to me, you know, I haven't had that years of, you know, having linked to these attacks. But like I said, we won't go too much into it. But I think it's definitely opened my eyes. But like Imran said, it's who's asking you, and why is it not obvious that you condemn Islam? And I think Imran's example with the neighbours is exactly right. You know, someone that knew you would never have to ask you that. It's just plain obvious. So yeah.
You know, there's one just to bring it slightly back to the topic. The other thing that we see, and this is probably where a lot of the rhetoric now in France from the political leaders is coming, is that when ratings are down for politicians, as they are for Macron at the moment. I mean, he's been down, particularly before these attacks, you know, and what an easy way in today's world, unfortunately, to get your ratings up is to become a populist.
Yeah.
And the best populists that do most well, I mean, we have the Marine Le Pen in France. We have a lot of support for her. There is an undercurrent within Europe of people moving to the right. So anti-Muslim talk, anti-Muslim rhetoric will give you ratings.
Yeah.
And a lot of some of the rhetoric coming out of France now, it's almost like on a war footing.
Yeah.
Because you gave us some quotes of us earlier on. It's really to try and improve some of the ratings, and it's cynical. Politicians should really be raising the levels in the society of cohesion. They should be raising into community dialogue and discussion, and trying to bring people together rather than making an us and them scenario. Because it's not like we've all repeatedly said that, you know, as a Muslim, we're held to very high standards religiously. In fact, the standards that I'm held to are so high that I would never be in contravention of any laws.
Yeah,
because my standards are beyond that.
Yeah,
that's right.
You know, and we're called to justice. We're called to doing the right thing, even if it's against yourself or your family members. We're not, and we're told similarly that a loss of any life is as if you've killed all of mankind. And the opposite is true. Saving of one life is as if you've saved all of mankind. I'm not referring to any specific ethnicity or group or religion, but we're talking about mankind. And really, this comes down to, we have to have our humanity within society needs to return. We need to be people who are humans and humane to each other, particularly now with the COVID and the difficulties that people are in. We're seeing losses of income, losses of jobs, and we're seeing more polarization because the people in power, rather than wanting you to question what are they doing to help the suffering, are getting us to point fingers at each other to lay blame about things that are happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think, you know, we've actually allowed this problem to fester, where now, you're quite right, the political elite realize that to be able to take away the votes from people like Le Pen, who are very, very popular. I think she won 20% of the vote or something, you know, really gaining a lot of support. Now, what do you do? Well, if you start talking tough against Muslims, shut down mosques, anyone suspected of anything, you come down a hard line. Well, a lot of those people that perhaps may have voted Le Pen might actually vote for Macron now, you see. And so this, under the context of freedom of speech, you allow huge amounts of money You know, one of the things, like, for example, Steve Bannon, right? His little tour of Europe was to go and meet these far-right organizations. So he met Le Pen when he came to Europe. He met our own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Yes. He met Wilders in Holland. Yes. Now, this guy's got a lot of money behind him to change public opinion. And he's known to be a far-right, nutcase, basically, right? So you allow people like that under the context of freedom of speech. You allow these type of people to invest and pump money into organizations that are going to create hate, that are going to change public opinion against Islam, against Muslims. And then when it comes to election times, what do you have to do? You have to join the club. You've got no choice now. Now you've got to become a far-right nutcase yourself. Otherwise, you're going to lose power to the nutcases who are on the far right, you see? Yeah. So it's this cycle of, and it's spiraling out of control of a situation, again, that was supposed to be noble, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And by doing so and not curtailing these type of activities, you yourself then have to start sleeping with the devil, right? In order to get elected. And this is what we're seeing around the world, right? Yeah. So unless you shift, and Trump, we're going to have a Muslim ban. Islam is at war with us. These are the words that Trump used. Islam is at war with us. And it worked. And it absolutely worked. Because you allowed that freedom of expression and freedom of speech to dehumanize a people, to change public opinion against them. And now those very same people want to vote for people who hate Muslims and want to be tough on Muslims. So now to get elected, what have you got to do? You've got to become part of the problem.
That's right. And I think Abbas, so I've been around Europe. I was in Hungary not so long ago, and I was shocking the amount of Islamophobia. I mean, we say Islamophobia. We're not even allowed to define the term, but you see not only that, but also racism. And the far right political parties, in France, you've got Marine Le Pen, and you've got, we've mentioned Holland. Hungary was shocking, but I don't think we even need to look much further from this country, even though I believe this country is not yet, and inshallah never will be, kind of fully right wing. That these political parties don't generally hold much weight over here. Our current prime minister did insult the niqabi. He called, what was it, dustbins and I don't know, it was post boxes and whatever he said.
Yeah.
But I think he also said black sacks as well, and I think so. You think targeting a group of people, a minority group of people who are already facing the backlash all around Europe.
Yeah,
that clothing is being banned. They're already facing hate in the streets. After a lot that's going on in the media, and you think the prime minister can openly say that, happily call it freedom of speech, not apologize. And so I think you don't even have to look abroad sometimes, and that, like, I think I back up what you said about perhaps Islamophobia now to gain votes. I don't believe these things are said accidentally, and the fact that he didn't even apologize for them afterwards, and to be honest, I haven't forgotten that. A lot of people were praising him over COVID and things like that. I just find it very bizarre how these things can just be left. I think if he insulted gay people, or if he insulted black people, or if he insulted any, I think he'd be held up to ransom, and I think there'd be a collective, the whole country would be standing against it. But for whatever reason, the Islam comments just slide by. And
as the rabbi said, words make worlds. It does matter what you say, and it does matter how you dehumanize a population, or you create an enemy of a population, and how people are then going to react to those people. We have a lot of sisters, predominantly our sisters actually suffer from a lot of racial abuse. Their hijabs being torn off. There are countless videos. I don't even like to watch them now because they're upsetting, of women even walking down the street with prams, with children, and people attacking them just because they're recognizable as Muslims. Our sisters have to go through a tremendous amount. And may Allah reward you for holding firm to your deen, sisters, because alhamdulillah, as men, we are proud of you, really. Because as a man, I think I would struggle to go through that much persecution and still be recognized as a Muslim. Subhanallah, I think I would really struggle. And the fact that our sisters do it, mashallah, that despite the persecution, despite the aggression, despite the vile comments, despite the looks, you know, you meet sisters who, for example, discuss how when they were, you know, some of them are white, when they were before they accepted Islam, you know, and how they were treated. And as soon as the hijab goes on, just a piece of cloth goes on their head, my God, all hell breaks loose. The way they're looked at, the way they're spoken to, you know, people start almost assuming they don't understand English. They start speaking loudly. How are you, dear? Are you all right? Like, yeah, I come from Essex. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to say to you is that this almost perception immediately changes, right? And so, subhanallah, whenever I see a sister, mashallah, she's practicing her deen, I feel very happy. I feel proud. I always pray that Allah reward the sister, because, mashallah, in such times, it's very difficult, really, to be seen as a Muslim. You know, the Prophet ﷺ said that there will come a time when the believer, to hold on to his religion, will be like holding on to a hot coal. So the Prophet already predicted that there would come a time when my ummah, when my community, when my followers will struggle to hold on to their religion like you hold on to a hot coal, because it will be difficult for them, because the environment around them will be created in this way. So the Prophet of Allah has already prophesied that difficulties will come ahead, that this hatred, this bigotry, this persecution will come ahead. But alhamdulillah, inshallah ta'ala, if we persevere and we remain steadfast on our religion, and we don't forget our humanity and our humility, which Islam teaches us, which Islam, imprints on our souls, our very souls, of remaining within the law, within the structure, and remaining controlled, then inshallah there's a much greater reward for us, you know. And we shouldn't forget that, I think, you know.
Alhamdulillah, absolutely right. And actually, we have an example of the targeting of sisters after these events, because we know that there were 2 sisters that were stabbed near the Eiffel Tower just a few days, I think a day or so ago.
Yeah.
And they were called, you know, the person, and by other women. Yeah. And the words that were used were dirty Arabs.
Yeah.
And what this points towards is this rhetoric that, you know, we were talking about the responsibility of politicians to make the society more cohesive. But if the rhetoric is such that you divide people, then what you do is you will find amongst every community there are some people who will respond to this in a way that none of the other members of that particular section of society would agree with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so these women who stabbed these Muslim sisters and calling them dirty Arabs is really, you know, an example of the fact that this is where the consequences of this divide and rule discussion on a political level can come. We don't want this. We want people of all backgrounds and thoughts, and, you know, in these societies to get on and live their lives. We can interact, we can disagree, and we can walk away. There should be no harm coming to people for their perspectives or their views. And, you know, really this is about the thing for me that I felt was important was that there's a conflation here between freedom of speech and demonizing the minorities within your community, within your societies. And this is what's happening. So the satire that Charlie Hebdo put out is specifically aimed at a weak community within the society. Macron talking about freedom of speech is bringing around anti-Islamic laws and preventing people from doing simple things, you know, such as going to school, attending hospitals with their conscience intact in terms of adhering to their religion. Now, no one is really saying that we should ban freedom of speech. No, these things are required and necessary. But we're saying that with the right to free speech comes a responsibility of using it in a responsible way, for the benefit of the society intellectually, for the benefit of the society in terms of a cohesive society. And that's what's missing now. We seem to go to extremes in our expressions to test the theory.
Yeah.
You believe in freedom of speech? Okay. And then you start abusing someone's parent or their prophet. And that's the wrong thing to do. And this is really what we're talking about. And inevitably, there will be people who react, and they're wrong to react. There's usually something else that's behind that's causing of their reaction. May Allah make it easy for everyone to understand and to get on with each other, and to realize actually that Muslims are just like everyone else. We also hate the things that are terrible and the killing and these things that are going on. And we're all from different backgrounds. I mean, Abbas, and Jordan and I, we're not from the same places. And I think the thing that unites us is our Islam.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely agree with that. And I would say that I personally I probably, and I don't know if this is part of being a Muslim or whether it's because I notice other people do it as well. I'm actually far more harsh on other Muslims. And I notice others may be the same back, because we have that standard. We have those standards that we're supposed to uphold. We have the example. So I think that's clear within the community. And I think Muslims are often accused of, covering each other up and doing things like that. In my experience within the Ummah, it's the opposite. You are, whilst, obviously conversations may not always be done on the internet or publicly. Muslims are very, very conscious that we are on at the moment there's a spotlight, and whether it's Speaker's Corner, whether it's online, if I was to say something here that was completely out of line, no doubt I would get a call later and say, brother, that's not what the Prophet peace be upon him said, and they'd give me examples. And we do have that, and I wanted to point that out, that and I think like Imran said, whilst we have that example, we are human beings, and some of us are stronger than others, and I think that's just common sense, because a lot of people, I had someone come on my stream when I did a stream about this saying, yeah, but if any Muslim responds badly, and I'm not talking about the attack here, I'm talking about just in general, responding maybe aggressively to offensive behavior, then they let everyone down. When to me, it's just common sense that if you're going to allow hurtful things to be said, offensive things, there are going to be people out there that maybe aren't quite on the deen or quite as strong, and even me as an individual, some months I may be better than others. Inshallah, I stay on the straight path all the time. But I think, Muslims, I think like Imran said, have to be treated as human beings. We're not just people that, just sort of punch bags that don't have the right to be offended at things that they hold dear. And as Muslims, we do hold things very dear to us. And, there may be some ideologies, I'd say atheism, where there's not really anything in life maybe that they hold as close as we do. But if we're all living together, I just feel like, and I think Abbas, you mentioned it earlier, there should be that empathy towards each other. There should be that understanding. And why do it? Why is there a need to draw a cartoon of the Prophet, peace upon him? What does that prove to anyone? What right does that really show that you have? When to me, it should be more about being civilized, being more about respectful, showing character, being someone of, being a citizen in your country that's actually respectful of others within it.
No, I totally agree with you, Jordan. And I keep saying that obviously that words make worlds, and the rabbi that quote that Todd Green quoted in his book. But that's what people need to actually realize, that me saying something does have an effect. Every cause has an effect, and it's just being mature enough and sensible enough to realize that when I say something, when I do something, that will have an effect on society. And as Muslims, the reason why we're not allowed to spread corruption in the land, why we're not even allowed to, for example, spread a WhatsApp or a message that we receive unless we verify the truthfulness of that, is because there's a huge emphasis that we don't do an injustice to somebody. And in fact, even if the message is truthful about somebody and it's a derogatory message, we're not permitted under Islam to spread the message to somebody else. That's the level of care that we have to take, not to take somebody else's right away from them. So we don't slander them, we don't backbite them. And I just think that these are good, wholesome qualities that all societies actually would benefit from. Because look at the situation that we're in now, Jordan, where we have this freedom of speech and freedom of expression. For the vast majority of people, they don't even know what is true or false anymore. You know, false news now has become mainstream news for a lot of people. We are in a society where a lack of control and, you know, and I'm not talking about stifling criticism, and I'm not talking about stifling debate and stifling discussion. I'm talking about, is it really freedom of speech to be able to spread lies and slander about people? Is that really the sort of freedoms that we want to fight for? Do we really think that society is better as a consequence? Do we think that we leave our, you know, our children in a better state of humanity and society as a consequence of allowing slanderous comments and slander and distrust of one another? Is that really a good thing? And I don't think anyone's being sensible and thinking about that carefully, I would hope would come to the conclusion that the freedom to abuse, the freedom to slander, the freedom to you know, create a disunity and distrust between communities, and encourage as a consequence people to be unjust and unfair to other people, you know, surely those are not the sort of freedoms that we would be, you know, wanting to promote and to be fighting for.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like I said, the reason I'm going back to Speaker's Corner is because I think freedom of speech has been a very big thing there. And look, I know for sure, if I turned up and I would never do this, but if I turned up and started, you know, with a Bible in my hand and started doing something with the Bible, let's say tear a page out or something like that, I guarantee you, Hashim and Mansour would grab each arm and pull me out the park and say, "What are you doing? This is not, you know, this is not right." And like I said, I just want to keep putting across that this is the standard that we have, and I think it's a good standard, and I think it should be reflected or seen from others as well. Whereas I often see, like I say, it's the Muslims' job to not be offended and to just stand there. Well, what about actually addressing the actual stuff being done, but you know, the provocative stuff being done before that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, if you started tearing pages out of the Bible, I guarantee you the other Muslims that were there would say, "Jordan, this is completely against Islam. What you're doing." I mean, literally. And they would actually, if you didn't listen, they would completely disassociate themselves with you. I mean, you're you know, I love you like a brother, but if you started doing that, you know, I would stop you. I would say, "This is wrong." And if you would not listen, I would disassociate myself from you.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because our morality and our sense of justice and our sense of fairness and our ties are first to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the principles of Islam. Our fathers and our mothers and our children and our wealth and our whatever it might be, it's all secondary. Our allegiance first is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his law, which is to be just, to be fair. I mean, I've mentioned it many times, you know, Harvard University put the verse of the Quran in the faculty of law, basically wanted to choose a statement from history that best reflected justice. And they wanted to select 3 statements. And out of hundreds of statements, they selected a statement from a man in the desert in the 7th century, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And they selected his statement, which is what they perceive to be his statement. But of course, as Muslims, we know it's the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, "O ye who believe, stand up as witnesses to God, even against yourselves, against your kin, against your parents, against your kin, whether one is rich or poor." You know, that's the level of justice, you know. Beautiful teachings in Islam, for example, even for example, you know, we're told the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that a non-Muslim living in a Muslim land who is under protection of the Muslims, basically, if he's treated unjustly, then on the day of judgment, I'll be his advocate against you. Now, that's the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, warning the Muslims that if you treat a non-Muslim unjustly in your land, I will be his advocate on the day of judgment. I'll be on his side. And we know that's a very serious, as Muslims, we know that's a very, very serious, situation to be in, right? This is not something trivial for Muslims. The Prophet of Allah, being against me on the day of judgment, standing with the non-Muslim. So our religion has explicit teachings of how we need to interact. And I actually think that despite where people may perceive these statements to be coming from, I think the world would be a much better place if people were to adopt these teachings, because I think it would be a much more respectful, much more harmonious world than what we're actually seeing at the moment. And one of the things that I want to just sort of finish up on, Imran, because I know the stream's going on a bit, and I think you guys probably want to finish up as well. But, at EFDawah, this was one of our goals when we first started, that the dawah would be to hopefully to show Islam for what Islam actually is to the best of our abilities, and to hopefully create cohesion and understanding between our communities, so that there wouldn't be this this fear. And so we've got our email address. Maybe one of the moderators can put our email address on the screen. If you're a non-Muslim and you want to ask us questions about Islam, you want to ask us questions about terrorism, you want to ask us questions about anything that you think is controversial, we're there for you. We'll hopefully contact you. We have free Qurans that we can send out to you, just so you can actually get a better understanding of what Islam is and what the Quran is, and what we actually believe, rather than getting your narrative from Facebook or other social media, or the right-wing press or media. Rather than getting your information from them, we're happy to send you out a Quran. Read the Quran for yourself and see, are there verses in there that actually say, kill everybody and do all of these bad things? Or actually, does it tell you to do something completely different? We're sort of here within the community, within England, and hopefully, alhamdulillah, our channels now, we have a global coverage, and we're a very, very small piece in the puzzle, just a very small organization trying to hopefully make the world a better place. But reach out to us. We're here. We're open. We're willing to discuss things. You might feel that are very controversial. People have asked me sometimes, non-Muslims, I want to ask you some questions, but I don't want to offend you. And I said to them, you can ask me anything, and I won't be offended. Anything, because in Islam, you can ask anything that you like. That's the sort of freedom that we have. But there's a big difference between asking a question and deliberately trying to antagonize somebody and trying to be insulting. Huge difference. We don't mind criticism, that you want to talk to us, you want to ask us questions, possibly interrogate us to find out really what Islam's all about. We're very comfortable with that. We have no problem with that. But let's do it within the boundaries of being civil and having manners and decorum. Let's do it with good faith, to truly want to understand one another, not to create hatred, not to come with preconceived ideas that you only want to reinforce. But this openness to learn, to want to find out. So as I said, we've put our email address on the screen. Feel free to contact us. Ask us for a Quran. We'll send you a Quran out absolutely free. You won't have to pay anything, not even the postage. We'll cover that for you.
Alhamdulillah. Jordan, anything you wanted to add, or any thoughts that you had?
I think it did come to our mind, and Abbas, I think beautiful at the end that we actually obviously give that invitation and invite people to come on. And obviously Abbas is saying non-Muslims and Muslims do come on as well. And I think in the present climate it's at, and the reason I want to mention this is because to be honest, I came from an ignorant mindset myself. There are many people in this country that are going around just listening to the news and then sort of quickly, briefly skimming it and going, "Wow, what's that? Wow, what's that? What, a beheading or what? What's that?" And so what happens is you get it breeds a lot of ignorance, and I think we are really the only people that can really perhaps or not change their mind, but answer any questions they have. And I think what I want to say is. My concern is when these things happen is that you get say some British people that may be ignorant, and they sort of say things to Muslims, and then Muslims feel less engaged and respond back, and you get that kind of thing that you see, because I think it mentions it in the book, The Stream. Mention it again next week. Don't miss it, with Todd Green, about this risk of actually pushing Muslims away, but through this. And I think what I want to say is, as Muslims, and Abbas is completely right, there are some people out there that I would say we completely avoid, and I think we know who they are. But there are many people out there that just need to be they just need to be educated, and they just need to meet a good Muslim. And so I would say, try not to be that responsive, maybe aggressive Muslim. Whilst you may be offended what they say, I do think we could do many good things to people. And like I say, I come from that mindset myself. Before I looked into Islam, I very much saw grooming gangs and terrorism on the TV, and it left a seed in the back of my mind that when it entered my family, I thought, wow, this is coming into my family. And that was my trigger into looking into Islam. And obviously then I got to meet you brothers. But yeah, I think that's the final message I think I wanted to say is that I wanted to be aware of the climate that's out there, that is out there at the moment, and to try and practice Islam as best as possible in these times.
Alhamdulillah, I think I have a similar experience to you, Jordan, but from the other aspect. So when I was young and not very practicing, one of the things that made me not very interested in Islam, apart from some experiences that I had that weren't very good from Muslims sort of who were teaching me, but one of the things was that there was lots of these sort of terrorist attacks happening in the Olympics, etc., and I didn't recognize myself in those things. So I was like, this is nothing to do with me. I don't want anything to do with it. And this is one of the things that prevented me really from trying to look further and deeper. And it's only when later in life, as I got into sort of having discussions at university, etc., that I was sort of drawn back into looking into these things. And I realized actually there is nothing, it's nothing to do with Islam in the first place. But I think you're absolutely right. So it's just a sort of, if that's okay, brother, just going to very briefly summarize. So we know clearly that Islam doesn't teach that this is the right thing to do, that it prohibits this. We don't condone. Islam does not condone vigilantism, and the Islam has a basic principle of the end doesn't justify the means. So you can't do something bad, even if you think you're trying to do something good. So it's not allowed anyway. We spoke about the hypocrisy of the way that the freedom of speech is applied. We talked about the fact that freedom of speech was really a noble concept of speaking truth to power. And we spoke about the fact that even satire was really aimed by the weak at the powerful within society. And what we're seeing now is that freedom of speech has become this thing that you accuse people of. You try to trigger people by giving them the most offensive thing and saying, this is my freedom of speech, to be able to offend you, which is the opposite of what it meant to be. And the satire that we're seeing from these sort of magazines that we're producing, not just an ordinary cartoon, but virtually pornographic sort of depictions of some people, the Prophet peace be upon him, what they claim is that who we adhere, we have deep connection with, and we love with all of our might. This is basically a denigration and a demonization of a minority in your society, again by the powerful, the authors of these things. So inevitably this will cause hate in the society. It doesn't justify what happened. I think that's we're very clear with that. But what we're trying to say is that in our societies we need to be able to have these discussions and improve our interactions and make the society more cohesive. So let's have our disagreements in an intellectual way. Let's sit down together and we can move forward in society, and let's make the society a place where everyone can live in peace and harmony, because we're seeing repercussions with the sisters being stabbed near the Eiffel Towers. And I think that's quite important, that we mustn't allow this sort of rhetoric to take off. We are our brothers and sisters. We are your brothers and sisters in humanity, whether we are from the same religion or not, and we respect everyone just by the virtue that they are human beings. And really what we'd like to do is to try and raise our way of interacting so that our societies can become better for all. May Allah make it easy for us all, inshallah.
I mean.
Fantastic points. And I think we're hoping I believe we're going to do some more streams, aren't we? Like this. I mean, we're hoping to put sort of review news and stuff like that. And so hopefully we can come on. And I think today obviously was a very, a topic that's very relevant at the moment. And hopefully we can cover a lot more. I've definitely enjoyed with you two brothers getting that Islamic perspective and balanced approach. And I think this stream's been fantastic. So Jazakallahu.
Inshallah, make it so.
So, as Brother Jordan said, we're going to try to make this a regular Thursday event where we're talking either about a topic specifically, or we're talking about something that's happened in the news, because these things are important, and we're trying to avoid shying away from the sensitive topics, and we'll try and raise them in a way that will, hopefully educate everyone and even ourselves, inshallah.
Yeah, feel free to email if you've got a topic that you feel that we want covered or something. Email us or Facebook us, and I think it'd be good to get some more streams going.
Okay, Jazakallahu everyone for attending, and please join us again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Jazakallahu.